Good morning, everyone, and welcome, and thanks for joining us today. I'm Steve Zimmerman, the founder, CEO, and principal broker of Restaurant Realty Company. I started Restaurant Realty over 26 years ago, and we have completed more restaurant, bar, club, and related commercial building transactions than any other broker in California during that 26-year period. Today, we're going to be talking about 5 top buyer and seller tips, which we think will be very helpful to you. I'm delighted to have Gail Lafayette, our project manager and listing transaction agent, join us today. Gail has a versatile background, which includes construction management, restaurant operations and management, and design, which makes her extremely effective in her work at Restaurant Realty. I will now have Gail introduce herself further. So please, Gail, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you so much. I've been with Restaurant Realty now for 7 years. It was such an honor to meet Steve, and it's been a great experience. My background is deep, as Steve mentioned, in management of challenging projects. And I do have a heavy hand in the retail store development, but it's really given me a good background into, managing challenging things. And when I was in college, it's kind of an interesting story. When I was in college, I worked at a coffee house. I was a barista at a coffee house, and I ended up becoming the manager. And being the manager was really exciting. It gave me a lot of good experience. And so people that have known me for a while, they probably remember a time when I wanted to open my own coffee house. I got really close to doing that. But in the end, I couldn't secure all the funding. That was during the Great Recession in 2009, 2010. And it was a really steep hill to climb then. But in the end, I ended up at Restaurant Realty, and it's been a great adventure and a pleasure to work with people in the restaurant and food service industry. So when Steve asked if I'd like to do the show, I immediately thought, well, this is a great way for Steve and I to get our top tips out. So I'm going to go ahead and we're going to start with our buyer tips. The first one is choose a strong location. Make sure the area that you're looking in is not saturated with the same concept as yours. And ideally, you should be in an area that's well-developed services, that has good foot traffic, street traffic, both is ideal. Steve, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, the old adage that I'm sure many of you heard before is the key ingredients for a successful restaurant or any business for that matter is location, location, and location. I think actually Statler, who was one of the founding people of the hotel industry. In fact, I was fortunate enough to go to Cornell Hotel School, and the main building was called the Statler Building, named after him. And that was his big comment: location, location, location. And if you have a concept that's not executed properly, and you need to change it, if you have a good location, the location will be forgiving, will give some forgiveness, so to speak, to your marketplace. If you need to, fine tune, change a concept. But if you have a bad location to begin with, and the concept doesn't come off right, you're really going to have a hard time, getting back on track. So locations are extremely important, to make sure, to assure that you're going to be successful. And in checking out a location, you want to make sure that you're not vulnerable to have a lot of head-on competition. Because obviously, within a certain given trade area, you want to have some degree of uniqueness to attract people, because generally speaking, most concepts draw within a certain radius of that location, unless it's very unique, where people may travel literally throughout the world. If it's like you're talking about a French Laundry in Yountville, something like that. But the typical restaurant, services a trade area of maybe a couple miles, depending upon the degree of density of that particular area. And so it's important that it's well built out. You're not going to be vulnerable to have a head-on competitor, boom, open within, a few doors or a few blocks of you, and which would lead to some severe cannibalization. And I think another strong thing about location is you want to make sure you have all the necessary tools to operate. In other words, you want to make sure you have the right operating hours. You're not going to have neighbors either above you or next to you. that are going to preclude you to operate, the proper hours. If you need to operate, to the late in the evening, you want to make sure that, the neighborhood's going to be compatible for that kind of, flexibility. Gail, please.
Yeah, that's a great segue into our next one, which is honing in on your concept. Do you have a concept in mind already? Are you looking to purchase a business with a concept? While some food service sales come with concept, they're typically at a higher price because they're profitable businesses or they're franchise. So you really want to know, what your concept is. Steve, do you have any other additional thoughts to add?
Oh, sure. And before I forget, I forgot to mention earlier that we like to entertain questions. So if you do have a question, please enter it into the question box, and sometime during the presentation, we will get to the questions. Hopefully we'll have time to get to the questions, answer them. And if not, we will capture your email addresses either through Facebook or our general webinar platform. So we will get back to you if we don't have time to answer those questions. But as far as the concept goes, it's obviously, your degree of risk is going to be minimized if you're buying an existing concept that has a proven track record. And because the reality is that unless you're a franchise, the failure rate, unfortunately, is very high for independent, non-chain, non-franchise operations. I think the general statistic is like 50% failure rate in the first 3 years, 80% in the first 5 years. So, and the inverse of that is true for a successful, seasoned franchise. So franchises, you have about an 80% chance of being successful. Again, if it's the right, franchise. There are a lot of franchises that are not successful, but you have a strong franchise that's not vulnerable for cannibalization. Your chance for success is much greater. But still, there's still plenty of non-franchise operators that come online, all the time and are successful. They're in that small percent of people that actually, succeed and have a long operating history. So I think now more than ever in choosing a concept, if you're going to start a concept from the scratch, you obviously have to have a business plan, and you have to make sure that your pricing points are compatible with the demographics of that location. If you're in a working class neighborhood, you can't have guest check averages of $50, $75 per person if the demographics won't support that kind of pricing structure. So the pricing structure has to be commensurate with the demographics. And again, you want to make sure you have a concept that's unique enough so people will be attracted in the immediate trade area to you. And now I think another factor which really comes into play as a result of COVID is that you have outdoor seating if possible. Ideally, you have drive-throughs, which is very hard to do, obviously, in urban areas. And for some concepts, that's not compatible. And you have enough spacing in the dining room, the interior dining room, so people don't feel, that they're on top of each other. And people are just much more sensitive about space, et cetera. So this is a whole new dimension as we've all witnessed, going through this challenging COVID period. So those are just a couple of thoughts in that regard. So Gail, please.
Yes. The next one we have is be ready for due diligence. Once you get into contract on the purchase of the business, your due diligence officially begins. You want to make sure you understand all the nuances of the business and the space itself. Check the equipment to ensure it's in good working condition. And many counties in California require a change of ownership inspection, which will help you identify if there's problems. But if this type of inspection isn't required, I'd recommend that you bring in a contractor who can help you identify if there's any issues. Steve?
Yeah. We've had some very hair-raising situations with change of ownership health department inspections. So it's really best if you're listing your business for sale to be proactive up front. And if you're in a county that requires change of ownership clearance, which means that the seller is responsible for those changes, unless it's an as-is sale, in which case the price is, reduced to reflect the fact that the buyer's going to take on that responsibility. But again, if it's a going concern, the buyer wants to make sure that that work is done before he takes over, because he's not going to want to close the restaurant, right after he takes over. He doesn't want to do anything to obstruct the cash flow continuity if he's buying a going concern. So he's going to want the seller to finish that work and make sure it's done and complete before the escrow closes, so that cash flow, continuity can continue. So depending again which county you're in, if you're a seller and you list your business for sale, I would suggest you have a change of ownership inspection done immediately and know upfront what you're talking about, and ideally take care of those things before the buyer comes along and makes his offer. And that will minimize the close of escrow period dramatically. I'm in a transaction right now where the deal is being elongated by about 90 days longer than it should be, because of the issue of the health department and coordinating, getting the plans into the health department. Health department is, shorthanded now because of COVID, et cetera. So again, be very proactive if you're in a county, and there are many counties that don't have stringent, especially in Southern California. We don't seem to see the degree of enforcement of change of ownership health as we do in Northern California, especially in the Bay Area. But that is a big issue. For sure. So please, Gail.
Yes, thank you, Steve. So the next one is get ready to impress the seller and the landlord. You want to make sure that you have your financial statements in order, check your credit report, and have your concept available for presentation. Create a menu or a sample menu, brush up on your resume, and that would include any of the partners that you're going to bring with you in the business. You want to make sure all the partners have their things in order. Steve, you have any additional thoughts on that?
Well, I think, as far as the landlord is concerned, you want to make sure that you have all the financial stuff that he requires, financial statement, credit reports, source of funds, that in some cases, they're going to want to see references from, if you've owned a restaurant before, they want to perhaps contact your former landlord. In some cases, they may want to see your personal tax returns, bank statements. In a lot of cases, they want to see where the beef is. So be prepared to have all these documents ready so you have smooth sailing through the landlord, because the landlord is usually the biggest challenge. Again, if you're an independent operator, most landlords look at you as being, someone that hopefully will be successful. But if they look historically at what has been the trend for independent operators, they see a large failure rate, and consequently they want to minimize their degree of risk. And so as such, they want to make sure that you're as qualified to, be a good tenant in good standing in their property for as long as possible. And so be prepared to have, these items ahead of time. Another thing that is important to have is that if you're applying for an ABC license, it's important that you will qualify for ABC, and that means that you've had no DUIs, driving under the influence citations. If you have, you can still get a license, but you have to go through a probationary period before the DUI is cleared. And if you've had a felony, you won't be able to get an ABC license. So those are just some of the top things that come to mind. Gail, please.
Great point, Steve. The next one is make sure you're properly capitalized. And I know this one very well, unfortunately, but you want to make sure you have funds for the purchase price, for saleable inventory, for escrow fees and closing costs, utility deposits, business registrations and fees, and if you plan to do a remodel. Steve, would you like to add some comments there?
Yeah, typically when you buy a restaurant, or I think any business as that goes, but especially in the restaurant business, you need to have a reasonable amount of cash. So for example, if the restaurant purchase price that you've agreed to is $150,000, more likely than not, when you add all the additional cash you need in order to be properly capitalized to operate that restaurant, you're probably going to have to tack on maybe another $100,000 onto that. And let me break that down just sort of generally. In addition to the purchase price, if you're buying a existing going concern, you're going to want to probably buy the inventory, the saleable. We say there's two kinds of inventory. There's fixtures and equipment inventory, which comes with the purchase price of the business. And then there's what we call saleable inventory, which is food purchases, beverage, alcohol, wine, beer, hard liquor purchases. Okay, so in addition to the saleable inventory, then you've got escrow fees, you've got closing costs, a deposit for the landlord. And I think to really be prudent in planning your future, you need to have working capital. And the general formula that I use is you should have 6 months of payroll. So if your payroll runs, let's say $20,000 a month, you should have another $120,000 just sitting in the bank, so that if there are situations that occur like, God forbid, another COVID or the Great Recession or an earthquake or any other kinds of acts of God that would definitely impair your sales, you have a reserve to keep your business going. There may not be PPP money in the future to bail you out. In fact, just as an aside, unfortunately, last week, the Senate voted down the increased funding of the Restaurant Revitalization Act. It was originally funded at 20 some odd billion. That money was taken, very quickly for the whole country. And they had a pending bill to increase the funding by another 40 some odd billion. That was rejected. And as a result of that, the National Restaurant Association has just stated that approximately 177,000 restaurants are going to be closing their doors within the next couple months, because a lot of people just holding on by a string, and hoping that this grant money would come through so they could pay their past bills, deal with the added extraordinary challenges today of labor shortage, increased costs of materials, and all the other factors that we face day to day living. Anyway, sometimes I get carried away here, so I'm sorry. Gail,
great stuff.
Please.
Great stuff.
Get me to shut up, please.
No, this is such good information.
Talk too much.
So now we're going to move on to our top seller tips. First, keep well-maintained, updated sales and operational records. This applies to businesses that are profitable, marginally profitable, or businesses that are struggling to make a profit. Even if a business is having challenges in profitability, buyers want to review the data on the sales and the operating costs of the business. And this is going to set a benchmark for them. It's more difficult to sell a business when there's no good records to give buyers. Steve, you want to enhance on that?
Yeah, now, when we're doing valuations in this post-COVID environment, obviously most people's, performance were negligible during 2020 because a lot of restaurants were closed part of that year, if not the whole year. 21, portion of that year, some restaurants were closed. So when we do evaluation of a restaurant, assuming a restaurant's been in business for 4 to 5 years, we're pricing a going concern business. In other words, a business that's making money and we're selling the proprietary items, the name, the menu, et cetera. We're looking at 2018, 2019, pretty much we throw out 2020. We do look at 2021 because there is generally an upward trend up from 2020. Hopefully there should be. And then 2022 year to date should give us some idea of what the future lies ahead to some extent. Still, 2022 isn't really fully capable of necessarily being indicative of the future because, again, there's labor shortages. So frequently restaurants are understaffed. And so they can't turn the kind of volume, they can't have the kind of turnover that they would normally have because it takes much longer to service a customer. And in a lot of cases, restaurants are closed some hours that they would normally operate, or days, because they don't have the staffing to operate. So, but in a number of cases, we've seen some meaningful resurgence in 2022. So we put a lot more weight on 2022 than obviously 2020. And we do look at 18 and 19. and try to be somewhat optimistic and hope that the restaurant will get back to those pre-COVID levels and then some. So that's certainly, how we go about, doing analysis today. It's just not black and white. Pre-COVID, you look at the last 3 years, you take an average weighted balance of the seller's discretionary earnings times a multiple, and then you come up with a sales price. It's not quite that way we do it today. We try to be somewhat optimistic, but again, realistic in terms of trying to come up with a meaningful sales price. Yeah, please.
Great, thank you. The next one is be prepared for many questions. You want to know the ins and outs of your business, or you want to have a partner who can help answer any questions that will come up about your operation during the valuation sales process. Steve, what are your thoughts on that?
I think that, one of the key components of a successful operation is obviously the employees. And so, again, I've indicated the added challenges of, staffing today. And so you want to assure yourself that those employees are going to hang around for the buyer. And so when the buyer comes into the scene, you want to get the buyer to meet them and to assure them that they're going to be fair and give them, an opportunity to, function the way they were before, and then perhaps some other opportunity. Recently, I sold a business, and it was a good sized business, and the buyer was obviously very concerned about keeping the employees. And so what we did is, after all the major contingencies were dealt with, we had a meeting with the buyer and the seller and the key employees. The seller felt it was best to talk to the management team first because it was a big operation, and got the managers on board and fully supportive of the buyer. And then subsequently he met with the other employees, and all the employees stayed. He offered them actually a wage adjustment, when he took over, and assured them that he was going to run the operation just as it was. And he had also operated other operations. So he basically presented opportunities to these employees that if they chose down the road, they could perhaps advance not only within the existing operation, but in some of his other businesses. So they had a real incentive to, give this new buyer a chance. So, and that's a big factor. Another thing that I think is a big concern for both the seller and the buyer, you want to make sure that, as the buyer, there's not going to be any pending zoning changes or surprises. There's something called eminent domain condemnation, which means that the government has the right, either at the federal, state, or local level, to seize property if they feel it's in the best interests of the of that entity, whether it be the state, city, or county. In other words, if they're, if Caltrans needs to expand a road or an off ramp, and your business is in the way, they have the right through this eminent domain process to basically buy your property. When I say seize, I should retract, not seize. They have the right to buy your property at a fair market price. They bring in an appraiser, and the appraiser is, prices the property at the fair market value, and then the entity that purchased the property from you pays that price. And I've actually gone through this on a property, so I know how it works, and it's usually a fair process. But obviously, if someone owns a business and they look at that as being their livelihood for the next 10, 20 years, they're not going to recapture all that lost income from the purchase of the property by the government. And again, this is only applicable if you own the building. Okay, so if you have a business within that building, you're going to lose your equity in that business unless you have a provision in the lease that the owner of the building, in case of a condemnation, will pay you some formula to be, spelled out in the lease agreement. So pending zoning change is a big deal. And again, not just the extreme of condemnation, eminent domain, but also if in a local area, like for example, I'm involved, I know of a property where the tenant is going to be turning over, and it's in a restricted retail zone, which means a retail chain zone. San Francisco has an ordinance that if you have 11 units or more, a business that has 11 units or more, and cannot come into this particular location unless they get an exemption from the city. And the exemption period takes 6 to 12 months. And there's no guarantee they're going to give you an exemption, because they put this law in place to keep the integrity of the local neighborhoods and not to have chains operations, throughout the city. Obviously, the city's become a little bit more lenient about that. I'm talking about San Francisco right now as a result of COVID, but nonetheless, it is an added obstacle. So that's something you need to be aware of if you're, a landlord again, and you're looking for a tenant, and the space warrants, a chain operation because they're the only one who can pay that kind of rent because of the size of the location, then you're going to have to deal with that issue. Those are just a couple of things that come to mind. Again, got a lot to say about these things. So, Gail, please go ahead.
Good stuff, Steve. The next one is grease the tracks with your landlord about a potential sale, and if they have any requirements for a new operator. The landlord, as Steve was chatting about, they're going to have a long-term relationship with the new operator, and they're going to have the final say in approving the new tenant. So, Steve, do you have any additions to that?
Yeah, I actually do. Yeah, landlords, again, are the key to making the deal happen. You should find out, what are the landlord's requirements up front, and make sure that, if it's going to be an assignment of the lease, California, if you're the seller, which makes you the assignor in the lease assignment process, you're going to be on the hook as a guarantor for the remaining base term of the lease and then any subsequent options. So you want to make sure, if that's going to be the case, that you can hopefully negotiate some sort of a burn off, which means elimination of your personal guarantee in some reasonable time frame. Usually landlords, if they're even thinking about entertaining that concept, the burn off, it's not going to be probably less than the remaining base term of the lease. So in other words, if there's 3 years remaining on the base term of the lease, and then let's say 2 subsequent 5-year options, if a landlord's to consider a burn off of the assignor's liability, the seller's liability, it's probably going to be related to the remaining 3-year base term. And assuming that the buyer or assignee is in good standing, he's met all the terms of the lease, then maybe they will consider eliminating the seller assignor off the hook. And that's a big concern for an older seller, he wants to enjoy his retirement years, and he doesn't want the thought that, after being retired for 3 or 4 years, that he's still got this liability hanging out there, and that perspective, a new buyer, could fail, and the landlord has exhausted their resources in terms of being made whole by the buyer, and now it's coming after me, after the seller rather, in their retirement years. That's not a very comforting feeling, very secure feeling. So in a lot of cases, what we try to do, in particular, if the seller is older, in any case, we try to negotiate a new lease. Assume the economics are going to be similar between the existing lease and the new lease. And that way we can definitively cut off the seller's liability on the lease. Because what happens is when the new lease goes in place, we also execute a lease termination agreement between the landlord and the seller, which becomes effective at the close of escrow. So therefore, if the new lessee and his new lease fails, the seller has absolutely no liability. And so that's a very big concern. Another big concern is obviously another thing that actually buyers really would like is some right of first refusal on the building if the seller of the building should decide to sell, but unfortunately most sellers, and it's understandable, most landlords won't go for that because that muddies the water for them in terms of being able to be out in the marketplace and not have any concerns by other type of interested parties that, oh, why bother when, you know, there's a first right of refusal and I'm going to get in a bidding war, and therefore it obscures the ability for the landlord to really maximize his price. So that concept possibly is not really very likely. However, a concept that does come into play occasionally is the first right of offer, where in the lease it says that a first right of offer means that if the landlord decides to put the building on the market, he has to go to the tenant first and ask the tenant if he wants to buy the building. And if the tenant and he agree, then they make a deal and the tenant buys the building. But if the tenant says no, doesn't agree to the price that the landlord wants, but he has a one-time shot, and then the landlord exhausts that exercise, and then therefore the landlord can just put it right on the market, and the tenant has no recourse to buy it other than as a normal third-party buyer would. And that can sometimes be a win-win situation. It gives the tenant an opportunity to buy the building, but if he can't come to terms with the landlord, then the landlord has total freedom then to put it on the market and try to get the best price possible. All right, please, Gail.
Thanks, Steve. Our next one is, before potential buyers come and take a look at your location, you're going to want to spruce the place up with the deep cleaning of the customer areas, the back of house, the kitchen, and don't forget the walls. You know, they could use a good scrub down or even a paint. This is going to help get interested buyers further interested and the best sales price. Steve?
Yeah, good points. You know, in a lot of cases, buyers don't have a lot of imagination. You know, what they see, is what they feel they get. They just don't have any creative perspective. That's not true of everybody, but a lot of cases they can't. Therefore, as Gail said, it's really best to have the place look as presentable as possible. You know, it's like going into a showroom and buying a car. You don't see dented cars or dirty interiors. You know, the car is shining and sparkling and everything looks wonderful. Ideally, that's the way a restaurant should look as well. And one thing we see that sometimes becomes an issue is that a lot of restaurant owners, they put a lot of their personal artifacts in the restaurant, you know, nostalgic items, you know, pictures of their family, pictures of employees. They may have some furnishings in there that were given to them by, you know, friends or family, and that are, you know, their personal stuff, and their intent is to take that stuff with them when the restaurant is sold. And in some cases, it's really best to get some of that stuff out of there, or all that stuff out of there, because most buyers think that anything they see is going to be included, you know, with the restaurant. You know, just to give you an example, listed a restaurant just recently. You know, basically the seller told us that all the equipment's included, and then we had a tour of the back of the house, and we hear from our buyer manager that, oh, the seller told the buyer that the pizza ovens and the pasta machine is not included. And so if that was the case, you know, we need to know that up front. Obviously, he can't take the pizza ovens off because he sells a lot of pizza, but that's not a good decision on the buyer's part. He should have told us about that up front, and because any buyer, again, going in there thinks that any of the equipment that's included is included. That's a normal, I think, response that most buyers are going to have when they see the place. So the moral of the story is, if there's going to be some equipment that is going to be excluded, make sure that the buyer knows that up front, and ideally try to get it out of the operation. But if you need that piece of pizza equipment, obviously, to serve pizza while you're still operating, you can't do that. But that's my 2 cents worth. Thanks, Gail.
Great. Thanks, Steve. And the next one is about the equipment. So don't defer any maintenance with the equipment or any other thing at your location. During the buyer's due diligence process, a physical inspection of the premises typically occurs. It may be required, or it could be optional. But if the corrective work is extensive, the buyer may walk away from the deal if the seller won't cover the cost or chip in to cover the cost. Steve, you have any additions to that?
Yeah, that's, when you're, again, people are expecting, again, unless it's an asset sale and a buyer is expecting to go in there and basically do a major remodel, then obviously some of the things that we're talking about are not as applicable. The change of ownership, usually because he's going to make major changes, he's going to have different change of ownership health department requirements that could be applicable to that remodeling. And so someone's just going in, buying the infrastructure, the plumbing, electrical, duct system, restrooms, et cetera, but plan to do major construction. A lot of the things that we've been talking about really are not as applicable, although they want to make sure that the basic mechanical systems are up to speed. We're trying to do a deal right now, and they want to lease the building, and unfortunately the landlord can't get his hands on the mechanical drawings, the plumbing, electrical, HVAC drawings, and those are integral for the lessee to determine, what his needs are going to be for, putting in his equipment and determining what kind of upgrades he may need to make to those mechanical systems. And so, in that case, obviously we need to get those plans. And so the city doesn't have them. So we're trying to track down the architect who did them. And there's enough surprises that go on in dealing with the day-to-day operations of a business or getting a business up and running without having to have added surprises, especially with all the government requirements and regulations. So it's really important that, the building is up to speed, and everything's going to pass muster with, the various departments that oversee, the different aspects of the business, the health department, the fire department, the building department, planning department, et cetera. So that's my 2 cents on that.
Wonderful. I think at this point we were going to do some Q&A.
Sure, absolutely. Let me go to the question box. Let's see here, questions. Let's see. Okay, here we go. Boom. No open questions unless I'm looking at something wrong. Let's see, which could be open that. Oh, okay. Let's see, is it possible we have no questions? I guess that could be.
Well, I have some additional tips if we want to go into
please.
Some final tips, for buyers, and Steve has touched on this already, to create a roadmap with a business plan. It's really great, and I know this firsthand. You definitely want to have that if you can. I mean, really, it's great to have the roadmap, and it's going to help you plan and organize. Steve, do you want to maybe?
Yeah, I think, absolutely. It's critical. The business plan is like a roadmap. And for those of you who aren't familiar with what, the basic components are in the business plan, it's basically an analysis of the demographics of the area, a printout of what is the per capita income, the household income, the educational level of the people, how much money they have available for spending for food away from home. But in addition to the basic demographics, you want to have an overview as to the management team that's going to be running the business. What is their background? Have they owned restaurants? Have they managed restaurants? Obviously, that's going to be key for both a lender, if a loan is going to be made by a lender, or for the landlord to make their decision whether they want them as a tenant, and how viable is their concept going to be. So they're going to want, in addition to management resumes, they're going to want to see a definition of the concept. In other words, a copy of the menu, the pricing, what physical changes they're going to be making to the premises. And they're going to want to see a pro forma, in other words, a projection of the income and expenses of the operation for probably minimally a 3 to 5 year period, on a conservative basis, not a, blue sky projection, but realistic conservative projection of income and expenses and the profitability. So it's a total sort of X-ray of the prospective operator, his background experience, his projected income and expenses, is the concept that he is proposing mesh with the demographics? In other words, is he is his $50 projected guest check average per person commensurate with the household and per capita income of the immediate trade area? And then also usually a recap of source and use of funds. Where is their source of capital coming from for the investment, and what the respective uses are going to be, and do they have the proper reserve set up? As I mentioned earlier. So those are sort of some general guidelines for putting together a business plan. It's an outline basically of how the proposed concept is going to operate. Now, normally, if you're doing a franchise, you don't need a business plan, or if you're buying an existing concept. But in some cases, even if you're buying an existing concept, the buyer may choose to make some changes to the operation, and therefore the landlord's going to want to see it spelled out. What are the proposed changes? And in more cases than not, those changes usually don't come into play until usually the transition of the sale occurs, so that the buyer can have an operating history and sort of learn where all the skeletons in the closet are before he starts making changes to the operation. Those are some of the factors that tie around the importance of a business plan when needed. So Gail,
I think I see some Q&A in there. Do you want to check it?
Go ahead. I will. So for some reason, maybe I'm not on the right track here. I'm going in the QA section. There we go. Okay, thank you. Okay, so first question from Michael Lanzarata. Any effect on sales price with rising interest rates? Good question. Well, it's obviously going to affect if you're getting a loan from an SBA lender. Most SBA lenders is prime plus a margin, and obviously the base is going up. So therefore, when they do the evaluation of the loan, it's going to affect. You're going to be paying more on interest, and therefore not have as much money available to pay debt service. It's like buying a house with higher interest rates. You can't get as big a loan because you have to service that added debt because of the added interest rate. Now, most of our deals are cash deals, so we're not really seeing a lot of effect on interest rates because, again, most people are paying cash. But again, if there is a SBA loan or any other kind of third-party financing, obviously they're not going to get as much. Buyer's not going to be able to get as much bang for his buck because they look at the ratio between the cash flow of the business and the debt service, the debt to cash flow ratio. So we'll have an impact if you're getting a third-party loan and you'll be paying interest. Okay, next question from one of our agents, Andy Maribel. If a deal is not an as-is sale and the Department of Health changes ownership report, uncovers and requires substantial upgrades or repairs, how would you navigate this with the buyer and seller? Okay, the deal is not an as-is sale. Okay, so just to be clear, an as-is sale means that the buyer is responsible for the governmental clearances, which means change of ownership, health department, upgrading ADA, American Disability Act, any new requirements by the fire department, et cetera. Now, if in more cases than not, that as-is clause doesn't really come into play unless it's going to be an asset sale where there's some intended construction or remodeling to be done by the buyer. So they feel they're going to have to basically walk the talk with all these agencies when they do their remodels. So it's not as much of a concern, but I think it's definitely very prudent for a buyer in his due diligence process to have a CASP inspection, which is a California accessibility specialist inspection, to make sure that the place meets the requirements of ADA. It has the proper ADA restroom, ADA access, egress, whatever the ADA requirements are. They're very extensive, so there are no surprises, and he can build that into his budget. Otherwise, if he doesn't anticipate all this, the ultimate cost of putting together the project could be much greater than what he is prepared to deal with. Let's see. Let me read this. If a deal is not an as-is sale, the Department of Change of Ownership report uncovers and requires substantial upgrades or repairs. How would you navigate this with the buyer and seller? Well, obviously, if it's not, it says specifically in our agreement that the seller is responsible to make sure that the premises meets all governmental regulations before the close of escrow. So that means that you're going to have the change of ownership inspection done. If it's apparent that there's some ADA issues, again, you need to have this CASP report done. And anything else that looks questionable, the electrical will not be up to speed. So it's incumbent upon the buyer in this due diligence process to bring in a general contractor to identify all the different points of concern, refrigeration upgrades, plumbing, electrical, HVAC, ADA, the whole 9 yards. So in a long roundabout way, that's the answer to that question. George has a question here. Hi, what is the best way to get demographics and psychographics of the area? Okay, that's pretty simple. Go to Google or any search engine and look for demographic studies. There are a number of companies that provide this for a nominal cost, and you get a detailed printout of all the demographics you need in order to, basically discern whether or not this location meets the criteria for your concept. Okay, another question from our friendly lender, Bob Porter. How are most business purchases being financed at this time? Again, we find that most of our deals are cash. Those that are not, we use SBA lenders. SBA lenders can lend up to 80% of the sales price on just the business, 90% if you're buying the building. And if you're buying the building and the business together, you can amortize the loan over about a 23-year period. So it's a great way to finance a project. And the major criteria to do an SBA loan is that the business has to be profitable. And you have to have, several years of tax returns supporting profitability and to meet the criteria of the loan to cash flow ratios that the lender requires. But it is a great mechanism for financing. Obviously, if you only have to come up with 20% of the money versus 80%, that will provide opportunities for a lot of the buyers that they wouldn't normally have if they didn't have this 80% loan to help fund the transaction. This next question is secondarily, have recent changes in interest rates changed anything? Haven't really done a lot of SBA loans, since interest rates have gone up so dramatically. But I still think, generally speaking, from what I'm hearing, is the SBA rates are still pretty competitive. So I would think not, but obviously I would like to, get that feedback directly from a lender because that's what they do full time. And again, we just small part of our deals. We basically deal with loans. But needless to say, the interest rate hike is not helpful for anyone that's trying to buy, either a house or business or any other kind of product. But it's a mechanism that the government feels is necessary to curb inflation. So another question from George, do you sellers carrying paper? What percent? Okay. In most restaurant deals, I would say less than 5% of our transactions is a seller willing to carry the financing because of the high risk factor involved. But occasionally they are, again, but it's less than 5%. And the rate is, pre the recent interest rate hikes, the normal seller carryback rate was around 4 to 5%. And the term ranges from 2 to 5 years, usually fully amortized. So meaning that interest and principal is paid monthly. So at the end of the term of the loan is totally paid off. And again, we don't see many seller carry back loans in the restaurant business because of the high risk factor. And I think most sellers are the frame of mind, they'd rather take a little less cash up front and not deal with the risk of, of having to collect, getting their loan paid back and taking back the restaurant. Okay, those are the questions. Those are the only questions I've seen so far. Unless, do you see questions anywhere else, Gail?
No. If I could, Steve, I just want to embellish a little on your.
Sure, please, on anything. Yeah, I've been talking too much.
No,
so go ahead. You can talk the rest of the show.
Yeah, the CAS inspection that Steve mentioned is not a requirement, and it's a special inspection. Right. So you have to go and seek that out. It's not required at all. I mean, some places in San Francisco, if it's a historical building, they'll want a CAS inspection, but again, it's typically not required. And it's really to point out the ADA, or the non-compliance with ADA, and that's why historical buildings, it would apply to them because they're typically an older building. The other thing I wanted to just touch on that you mentioned was a question, is the SBA loans. And we're not doing a lot of those because it's really for profitable businesses, right, Steve? I mean, the SBA, they're looking for a business that's profitable. So that's probably a good reason why we're not doing a lot of those. I mean, Steve would.
Yes, I'd say that's generally the case, but we certainly love opportunities where an SBA loan can be applicable. It certainly makes the business a lot more desirable. It expands the buyer base. And so if we have an opportunity to list a business that is profitable, we will, in more cases than not, try to get it pre-qualified by the SBA. We'll submit to the SBA the books and records of the operation and get it pre-approved. And so that when we get a buyer in place, then the other part of the puzzle is that the buyer has to be approved by SBA. And it's a great mechanism for buyers to purchase businesses they wouldn't ordinarily be able to buy. I mean, for example, if you're selling a business for $500,000, obviously the buyer pool for that of buyers that have $500,000 are far less than buyers that have $100,000. Because again, if they're going to do an 80% loan or $400,000 loan, you need basically $100,000 for the purchase price. Obviously, you need more cash for working reserves and the other costs that I mentioned earlier. But it's a wonderful mechanism to expand opportunity for the buyer pool, for sure.
Okay, great. Do we have some more time for some additional tips? Or?
I don't know. We've had some interesting transactions recently. What I just sort of looking back at some of the more recent deals, or the deals we're doing right now. And Gail works with me on my transactions. I'm fortunate to have her input. But I think one of the, what do you see other than the long time frames that it takes between buyer to respond, seller to respond, landlord to respond? What are some of the typical issues you're seeing right now as we're trying to put together deals today? What are some of the things you're seeing?
Yeah, I think they're each unique and depends on how motivated each party is. Sometimes people are so busy they can't get to everything that's going on, and they want to really review things. So it is really a case by case basis. Although some of the with the liquor license transfers, when those come into play, there's no really control from any of the parties. It's the governmental agency doing it, and people have to be patient doing that. So there's a lot of moving parts and reasons why the timing wouldn't be exactly why a buyer or seller would want it to be or expect it to be. And that is a question that we get a lot, is how fast can you sell my restaurant? And again, there's not really a formula there. It's really who's looking in that area at that specific time, and you just never know.
Yeah. I know one thing we have found on a deal that Gail and I are working on right now. We have a deal where there's multiple buyers involved, and they all want to put their 2 cents in, and so it becomes an added challenge when you got 4 or 5 buyers with all different opinions, getting them on the same page and getting them to move on a timely basis. That deal we've got going on right now. that falls in that category. But those are the challenges of doing deals, and that's why they hire brokers to deal with all the obstacles and challenges of getting a deal to the finish line. And because we've been doing this so long and we've done so many deals, we are pretty used to dealing with all the obstacles that come into play.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Well, I think I have a few more tips. I'm just going to
please
run through some more. For a buyer, if you have no experience in the industry, look for a partner. You'd want to know them, and hopefully you would know someone that has experience. That's really going to help with a lot of the challenges, not only with the landlord, because a lot of times the landlords, they want experienced operators so that they know, typically it's going to be a long-term lease that you're going to get involved in. They want to know you're in it for the long term, and you've got a strong team behind you. Steve, what do you?
Yeah, if I could just add to that. Not only is the landlord going to require that, but if you're going to get a loan, you're not going to be able to get to first base with a lender unless you've had experience, because they know the high probability of failure in this business, and they want to mitigate their risk, and therefore it's imperative that to get to first base with a lender that you have had lots of experience running and or owning and or managing the restaurant. The only exception to all this is if you're buying a franchise, of course. And in that case, the franchisor gives you the training, and in a lot of cases they prefer you don't have experience, so you don't have any bad habits, and they can train you in the method of their operation, all the unique features of their franchise. But again, we do sell franchises occasionally, but again, our sweet spot is independent, non-franchise, non-chain restaurants.
Okay, great. I'm going to move on to a few extra seller tips. We have just a few minutes left.
we have just a few more minutes. Let me just check, see if there's any more questions. Let's see, but go ahead, please.
Something that has been catching us at the end, a little off guard lately due to COVID and the backup with the California Department of Tax and Franchise. Once you have a buyer lined up, you're in escrow, you know your date that you're going to close the restaurant, please, get ready to file your final sales tax return, do the closeout paperwork, have that all lined up. Don't wait for escrow to do it. It just adds more weeks onto the end, potentially, not all of them, but a lot of them. It's adding time onto the end. Or if it doesn't close escrow, your proceeds are getting held until they have all the clearances and they know everything's done. Well, the clearances maybe not necessarily, but they want to make sure that your final payment is in. So that's just something that is, again, out of our control, and any of the parties involved. It's out of all of our parties' control, except for the seller filing those things, and that will help the process.
Yeah.
Steve, you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, very good point. Yeah, in more cases than not, unfortunately, escrow is instructed by the state tax agency to hold, a certain amount of the funds, if not all the funds, until they receive their last payment. And if you're selling an existing operation, you're running it right through the close of escrow, you can't file your final state sales tax return until after the escrow closes, and then you close out your account, and then you submit your tax payment to the government, and then it takes a week or so to get a clearance. So don't be surprised that when an escrow does close, and if you're the seller, your funds or part of your funds are going to be held back until the final clearance, because again, in a bulk sale escrow, the buyer has to receive clearances from the state sales tax folks, the franchise tax board, and EDD, because if they don't get clearances from that, there is successorship tax liability for the buyer. That's one of the main purposes of doing a bulk sale escrow, is to protect the parties, to make sure that the respective parties pay their bills.
That's right.
Okay. Anything else, that you'd like to cover?
Quick last one.
Yeah, last one, please.
Okay. So the last seller tip is going to be, if you've got a beer and wine license or a liquor license or ABC license of any type, make sure you know what the expiration date is during your sale. Sometimes it's going to happen during the sale. Your expiration date's going to fall, and you don't want to let that lapse, or you can't transfer it. So you want to make sure that, and ABC does double dip. They take from the buyer and the seller, if it's happening right at the same time. And it's just one of those things you want to make sure you know where you stand with that.
Yeah, very good point. Yeah. Yeah, people don't like to hear the word double dip, but unfortunately, ABC does double dip on the renewal fees. So the seller and buyer both have to pay them. But I think that pretty much comes to the end of our time. If our audience would like to get in touch with you, Gail, what's the best way to get you? Please.
They can email me at gail@restaurantrealty.com. And so it's GAIL @restaurantrealty.com.
And if you want to get in touch with me, it's steve@restaurantrealty.com. And we appreciate your attention and your interest. And if we can be of any service to you, either as a buyer or seller, or if you need any advice, if you're considering buying a business, buying a restaurant, bar, or club, or related commercial building, please feel free to get in touch with us, and we would like to work with you. So again, thanks for joining us today. And most importantly, everyone stay well, and look forward to seeing or talking to you again sometime in the near future. All right, take care. Have a good day. Thank you, Gail, for co-hosting. Enjoyed having you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.